When the night is falling, hear the piper calling, loudly and proudly calling down through the glen. There where the hills are sleeping now, feel the blood leaping high at the spirits of the old Highland men.
Pure excitement. Everything was great fun in England. The English fans were coming to Glasgow, and in those days it was fun and banter, no viciousness or any animosity whatsoever. It was a party time.
William Griffin was 15 years old when the English football team arrived in Glasgow in the April of 1937. He got a ticket through the Scottish Football Association's allocation to schools. He didn't know it as he caught a tram to the south side of the River Clyde, but William Griffin was about to join the biggest soccer party in history.
It's probably hard for people to remember now just how important Scotland-England matches were then.
Russel Galbraith, author of the Hampden story.
Before the war and through the 40s and the 50s, this was a great international sporting occasion, and there was no year better perhaps than 1937 when England came to Hampden. I mean, this was the first all-ticket match ever organised anywhere in Britain. The SFA secretary of the time, George Graham, appears to have done a marvellous job in organising the sale of tickets. Hampden, it was expected to take something like 150,000 people. In the event, they sold 149,414 tickets. But there's no doubt that many more people were present for the game. Indeed, many people who climbed the walls or indeed paid for the privilege could have seen very little of the action.
They were the golden years of the people's game, as William Griffin explains.
The working man in those days had no other option. Football was it. There was no other TVs or anything to distract him from the love of football in those days. I've been to regular games and it was nothing to see 60,000, 70,000 at Celtic Park or Ibrox or Hearts in Edinburgh. 40,000, 50,000 was normal because, again, the working man had no other thing. That was his only sport.
By 1937, Scotland had played England in the world's oldest international fixture on 63 occasions. There had been 18 draws, 18 English victories, and Scotland had won no fewer than 27 of these games, most of them in the vast cathedral of the National Stadium at Hampden Park. Quite simply, as Sir Stanley Matthews remembers, Scotland expected, and England did not.
Scotland always could beat England. There were much skillful players than we were in the years gone by. And then, of course, we had to go for the Hampden Roar. And that was something that was frightening. Ambition for a young player when you're at schoolboy was you wanted to play for your local club. And then the second you wanted to win a Cup Winners' Medal. And then you wanted to be an international player. Now, to be in that, you always wanted to play Scotland. You want to play at Wembley and also Hampden, because Hampden has got the tradition.
The 22-year-old Stanley Matthews arrived for his first game against Scotland at Hampden Park, in a city which was bursting at the seams and throbbing with anticipation. Such a congregation had arrived in Glasgow on the morning of the match, including an estimated 30,000 visiting English fans, that many set off to walk to Hampden immediately after breakfast. Glasgow's city fathers warned their cafes and hotels to be prepared to serve 220,000 extra meals as the special trains rolled steadily into Central Station on the dark hours before the dawn. The biggest day in the biggest footballing township in the world had arrived.
Never before in the city's history,
the Sunday Mail would report,
has its streets presented so bizarre, so animated, so completely cosmopolitan in appearance. It was the biggest crowd since Armistice 1918. From every part of England, Scotland, and even from Ireland and Wales, men, women and children rubbed shoulders with each other. Hampden Park, with the greatest attraction which the world has ever staged, has drawn into the city a throng which may never be equalled. Glasgow's policemen found the evening an anxious one. At every point they could be seen straining to understand the southern accents of the visitors.
Every newspaper was filled up with what this player says he's going to do and this player. And it wasn't hype as we know the word today. It was building up enthusiasm for the game. You were a captive audience. Soccer or football was it up in Scotland. I mean, in England at least had their cricket to divert their attention, but in Scotland, football was the whole object. And it was, I can only use the word fun. It was fun. People enjoyed it. The players enjoyed it.
And they streamed towards Hampden Park in their tens of thousands. Jed O'Brien is project director of the Scottish Football Association's Museum Trust.
By 1937, Queen's Park had spent about 150,000, which really you're looking at about 8 million in present money on the whole ground, and the ground had been registered then to hold almost 185,000. And I'm pretty certain they got very close to that, especially in the two 1937 matches, the Scottish Cup final and the England game. Given the fact that there was a standing tradition of people either climbing over the walls or getting through the turnstiles without paying money, then I reckon that this ground held close to 185,000 on quite a few occasions, and particularly in 1937.
Those 185,000 people, the population of a small city packed into a few terraced acres, made a noise which nobody who ever heard it would ever forget. Fans, feeling their own power, revelled in it.
The roar really started when the two teams ran onto the field, and it was a crescendo. I mean, it just sounded like something was coming, a train was coming from a distance, and it's getting nearer and nearer and nearer and nearer until it whizzes past you. But it doesn't whiz past you, it stops, and the roar continues.
Historians have analysed it.
My theory is that the bowl shape that Hampden is somehow helps to magnify and hold in the crowd noise. And one thing I've always noticed here, that you almost get a second shock wave. When the crowd roars, then there's a rumble like thunder a second and a half later, and another massive noise comes crashing down upon you. One other place I've noticed it at is the new camp in Barcelona. And I think that the pure design of this ground, either deliberately or inadvertently, meant that the ground itself amplified the cheering of the crowd, which was massive anyway because of the great numbers that came. And that's what intimidated teams and gave, especially the Scotland team, a fantastic lift.
It's perhaps almost impossible to imagine in a day of comparatively small, all-seated stadiums the effect of the presence of the crowd on the players at Hampden. These were the days of the famous Hampden roar, a great beast of a thing that actually swelled and swelled and swelled whenever Scotland were attacking or Scotland needed assistance, and indeed it could be heard right across the city. Obviously, whenever a goal was scored by Scotland especially, the very windows rattled in Somerville Drive and all the way across the town. It was indeed Stanley Matthews, perhaps the greatest English winger of all time. He once said that if ever a match was won and lost by a roar, this was it, that the 1937 match. I mean, Matthews certainly was among those who found himself a little in awe of that great noise.
The modest Matthews may not have realised it, but he himself was causing a few nerves in Glasgow on the morning of April the 17th, 1937. His extraordinary reputation had preceded him.
The cigarette companies gave out cards in those days, in the packets. And I always remember one of Matthews, and he was only a boy of 16, playing for Stoke City. Now here he was amongst the elite of English footballers, and as a young man, he was everything that a young footballer should want to be. He was perfect in his deportment. He was so skilled, it would take volumes to write about the man. And the man's own personality. He was humble about it. There was never any braggaggio about Matthews. And a prime example to any person that ever wanted to be a star in football.
And initially it seemed as if England might be about to confound the huge Scottish support. Matthews always enjoyed playing with the Sunderland inside right, Rach Carter.
Rach was an outstanding player. Rach, he knew where the ball was. He read the game very well. If he moved himself to the outside left, I bet the ball would go to him.
Oh, the great game was end-to-end stuff. I mean, there was plenty of, I can't remember every individual piece of good football, but as I say, Carter and Matthews began to stand out. And it was only good defending by the Scottish team that kept them at bay for a while, until eventually England did score the first goal through Steele of Stoke City.
Freddie Steele was a great centre forward because we were brought up together at Stoke City, you know, working on the ground and in the dressing room, cleaning the boots and so on. We both were together when we were 15 years of age. He had the pace, he had change of pace. He was fantastic with his head. He was quick. He could hit the ball with his left or right, just the same. And he looked like he was becoming one of the greatest stars in England.
And the game continued. Scotland were pressing. They had a couple of near misses, and finally O'Donnell cracked it, and we were 1-1. And that was just after half-time. The Hampden rower was always classed as the 12th man in the Scottish side. Into the second half, as I say, the Scottish team was definitely taking control of the game, but the game was more at that end than the other end. And eventually, Bob McPhail, I forget whether it was a corner or just a cross, Bob McPhail headed the second goal. From then on, it was all party time. We were winning. And when Bob McPhail scored the last goal, that was the icing on the cake. It was all over.
As the English goalkeeper, Vic Woodley, picked the ball out of the back of the net following McPhail's second goal and Scotland's third, he looked around him at the wall of noise and shrugged, as if to say, who could beat that? And never again would Hampden attempt to contain a crowd of that size, whether it was the official 150,000 or the unofficial 185,000. The gate for that match in 1937 is a standing European international record. There were no deaths, no injuries, and no reported arrests. It had been, as William Griffin said, one big noisy party, and in the years to come, there would be many more.
Hark, when the night is falling, hear the piper calling, loudly and proudly calling down through the glen. There where the hills are sleeping now, feel the blood a leaping high at the spirits of the old Highland men. Towering and gallant fame, Scotland, mountain hymn, hiding your proud standard gloriously wave. Land of my high endeavour, land of the shining river, land of my heart forever, Scotland the brave. Way up among the highlands, out by the purple islands, brave are the hearts that beat beneath Scottish skies. Wild are the winds to meet you, staunch are the friends to greet you, kind as the love that shines from fair maidens' eyes. Towering and gallant fame, Scotland, the mountain hymn, hiding your proud standard gloriously wave. Land of my high endeavour, land of the shining river, land of my heart forever, Scotland the brave. Land of